So this is the first of a full-length episode of an interview for Let's Talk, and my guest is Sudeep Sen, who is a poet, writer and photographer. And what I enjoyed about our conversation was that he's also a filmmaker, and we got to talk about the editing process, we got to talk about light and living in New Delhi. So this is an exciting sort of project for me because of the depths of our discussion that we went into. So I hope you enjoy it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Let's Talk YouTube website and enjoy the interview. So this is Let's Talk, and my guest today is Sudeep Sen, who is a poet, writer and photographer. So welcome to Let's Talk.
Thank you very much.
Sudeep. And we normally, the purpose of these interviews is to basically go through and find out a little bit about how you've got into the area that you're sort of working as at the moment, as a poet and a photographer and a writer. So tell us a little bit about how did you get started?
So I have to say that, literature, music, art, all the lovely things in life, so to speak, is very much part of a Bengali landscape. I come from a very specific part of India, which is Bengal, which is the sort of the east, the state of Bengal. And pre-partition Bengal would include Bangladesh, so that's the entire Bengali-speaking area, the original one. However, I grew up in Delhi, but in a Bengali household with all the ethos or baggage that the Bengalis carry. But in a sense, it was a privilege because access to the arts was almost osmotic. It was there without being forced down. Also, of course, I have to admit that I was growing up at a time when men were supposed to be engineers and doctors. All this was great, but you have to have a job, and jobs at the time meant these are the areas where you would have more chance to make a living, good living. So I was a science student, So I studied physics, chemistry, biology, architectural and engineering drawing all the way through school, and I was actually almost fairly serious about studying architecture, but somehow or the other I just said, let me just give it a go. I mean, I was always interested in reading and writing, and I wrote my first terrible bad poem in high school, and continued writing terrible bad poems from my undergraduate years, but I persisted because it was more a passion than anything else. And I told myself that, listen, I'll give it a go. If it all doesn't work out, I can always resort to something else, And that's really how it started. So I come from a sort of science background with an interest in architecture, and all that sort of feeds into my writing and my photography.
So it's science-based, and you mentioned the partition coming from a kind of Bengali. We've lived in Ireland here, and we've gone through our troubles here.
Yes.
Or it would have been about sort of 15 maybe years after the partition that you would have been born. So how would life have been around about that sort of time for you?
So I'm very much a post-partition child. So I didn't see the turmoil and the difficulties which my grandparents and my parents might have seen. It's almost like partition stories. So India was partitioned on two flanks, actually, Pakistan and India, which is, that's much more recorded in a sense. And then on the east, it was Bangladesh and West Bengal, what became Bangladesh and West Bengal. So a lot of it was just stories from my extended family, books I read, films I saw, nostalgic songs. but it didn't affect me in that kind of direct way. So I grew up in a very democratic, cosmopolitan Delhi um, with three mother tongues: Bengali, Hindi, and English. Um, so it was. I mean, these are languages I've been speaking ever since I've been a young child, and but as an adult, I see the both the political, intellectual, and emotional ramification of what partition is all about. And we are sitting in Ireland, and I'm very aware of the situations here and the changing geopolitics of the place. Not terribly dissimilar in terms of, people are people at the end, and the rights of what they want are very similar to the rights people want elsewhere in the world. And it's all about equality, humanism, fair play, and so on. I mean, these are all very universal things. Free yourself from the colonizer, so to speak, and so on.
Your science, then, we've gone quite a distance in science from the sort of 80s and things to now. So what particular things in the scientific world would have influenced maybe your writing in your early days?
Oh, many things. Actually, there's a lovely story. So when I was in college, I think one of our professors was teaching the metaphysical poets, John Donne, Spencer, and so on. And there's this famous poem. There's several famous poems, but one of them is The Compass. One of them is The Sun Rising, busy old fool, unruly sun. Now, when we were taught that, we were just given the literary and historical sort of background, cultural background of the poem. But what astonishingly my professor missed, and everybody around us missed, was the poem was actually written when Donne had access to Copernicus's first telescope. So when he looked through the telescope, his entire vision of the cosmos changed. So it's a very, very important fact that is rooted in this, in a discovery of science or scientific tools that led to writing a poem. But that was never discussed. So as a science student, I was alive to all those things. So I could sort of see the other side of things. Also, just physics and light interested me a lot. So it's not unsurprising that my latest book is called Fractals. Yes, very much from that world. And I think science has shaped my writing. So in terms of structure, I started out being a fairly formal poet. So I would write in strict forms, sonnets and villanelles and canzones and rhyme. And it was a good starting point because partly I was mentored by some people I really admired, and they said it's very important to learn the classics before you can break the rules. You wouldn't be producing Stravinsky's Rites of Spring if he wasn't properly trained as a classical musician. Even though when you hear it for the first time and to an untrained ear, it's almost atonal and dissonant. So all that helped a lot. My interest in meter and rhyme was again prompted by mathematical equations and physics. The way I look at objects is very much influenced by the way I used to think about light when I was thinking of physics and refraction and reflection and so on. So it's always been a very, very strong shadow in my writing space. Though it's never obvious, but if you just have to kind of, reflect a little bit to see the refractive index in my literary writing. So science has always played important part, and I have to say that I grew up in a space where the sciences and the arts were not separated as hierarchies. One wasn't more important than the other. Because realistically, as a holistic thing, it's one side of your brain is logical, and the other side is creative, and it's all the science and the creative aspects of our lives are working always in consonance. But yeah, The both are very important as far as my literary work is concerned.
You mentioned the telescope, and you're a photographer as well, so obviously there's a connection between the telescope and your own work as a photographer. Would you like to talk a little bit about the photography?
Yeah, so it again links up with the idea of fractals, light. I I'm actually quite like you, very interested in how we can shape images in a formal construct. So, for instance, right now you can only see me in a rectangular frame because of the way technology is, unless you used an oval lens or you mask certain things. But the natural thing would be just a rectangle. Yes, you can tinker with the aspect ratio and so on, but that's only gradation of the wider rectangle. So one of the things that interested me a lot was what you see in that frame or the rectangle. Okay, that's the obvious thing. But what you're not seeing is and influencing that frame is probably even more interesting. For instance, right now we are in shooting in natural light. So the way the viewer would see us is so much dependent on something that we cannot control, which is the outside light. The same shot on a sunny day would evoke very different kind of feelings. Maybe there'll be sweat on my forehead, there'll be more bees buzzing around, the colors will be more saturated.
Contrast ratios
The
would be higher.
contrast ratio
Yeah.
would be much more severe. So it's like saying that on a printed page, the white space is just as important for me as the printed ink part of the page. People only focus on the obvious, the words, or the image, or the dialogue in question. But often we forget the silence or the silences that actually makes the whole um, idea of the metaphor much more cohesive and a whole, really.
I like that idea because I remember when I do a lot of artwork, and we will often do line drawing.
Yeah.
And one of the art pieces I produced was where I just drew the shadow, and it meant that you literally had just a shadow, and your eye then filled in where you thought the shape of the person would be on the other side. So it's exploring the same kind of idea.
Yeah, it's the whole idea of umbra and penumbra. You know.
You talked about rhythm. Is music an influence in your poetry?
Very much, very much. How can you possibly stay away from music and dance? In fact, I will talk about the music a little bit later, but dance certainly excites me a lot more because my next book is on classical Indian and Western dance. The book is called, the book is tentatively titled The Whispering Anklet. It's the anklet that women wear, the dancers wear, especially for Indian classical dance. And it's an obsession of mine which has been, there for at least 20, 25 years. The kind of high I get when I watch a good dance performance and when I come out of the auditorium or wherever the dance is. I just don't think I can get it anywhere else. Because in an interesting way, dance incorporates all the things we were talking about. Its performance, its structure, its rhythm, its music. A lot of the dance is actually dance to sung songs, which is actually written poetry in meter. Then the choreography, of course, requires lighting, and so, and any one aspect, if it's out of kilter, the whole thing can fall apart. Similarly with film, I mean, you use the same sort of tools. So, yeah, music, rhythm, dance, they all go very hand in hand. I mean, I always have music on when I'm in the house, in my office, in my study. Um, Even when I'm writing, I mean, if I'm writing, it would be probably instrumental and at a very low volume. Um, if there's no music, I have this sort of earthen bowl with earthen frogs. It's like a little water spout. It's one of these little Zen garden thingies, but in miniature. So there's this constant, lovely sound of water, you know, gurgling in a sense. it just gives you that sense of um, warm, and you're in touch with Mother Earth. And it's also very similar to Indian classical music because you'll see there's always a person behind with a stringed sitar-like instrument, which just basically they strum to keep the background tonal registers in order. It sort of provides the bass. Um, so the same thing, to me, they're all very similar structurally, and that is the advantage maybe I see now. Of course, as a youngster, I had no idea of all this, but I see now the similarity and the importance of formalism and what you break away from. So, how structure, rhythm, line, light, musicality, cadence, texture, they all work in very similar ways in any of the art forms we pick, be it writing or photography or filmmaking or dance and music. So they are very interlinked as far as I'm concerned.
Is I've spoken to a few writers, and as an editor myself, as a film editor, I tend to work with timelines, and I'm very structured in where things should happen, and all that kind of. And as an architect, I'm sure you've had to deal with structures within. You talked about the frame, which is quite interesting. Within your poetry, do you follow similar sort of patterns in structure, or how do you work with things in the
So when I
poetry?
started out, I was actually, as I said earlier, I was a more formal poet. So then the structures are pre-laid. So if you're writing a sonnet, then the structure's already been prescribed to you. Of course, there are variations in sonnets. You can have a Shakespearean sonnet or an Alexandrian sonnet, or there are various kinds of sonnets. But they're all prescribed, so you're writing within that. Um, um, and that's useful because you're actually really learning the tools of the trade. It was the norm at that time in that age, but now with the way that our diction and vocabulary and sound of language and sound of art in a more holistic way has changed, that those older rhythms may be dated. So we constantly find new metaphors and new languages to we have to explore different things. So once you have that structure, it's you can break away and innovate and make new structures. So for instance, to put dance music and poetry together, there's a poem I wrote called The Bharatanatyam Dancer. It's one of the classical Indian dances. And initially, when I watched the dancer on stage, I was completely smitten. I said, "My God, this is brilliant." So I wrote a version of the poem. But as I was going through various drafts, I saw there's a patterning that started emerging. And then I said, "This is interesting. Let me just push this further." And then I asked the dancer, could I possibly, see some of her rehearsals, but from not the proscenium space, that is the X, Y of the stage, the frame, axes of the frame or the stage. And of course, we imagine the depth, which is the Z axis. I said, no, let me just dispense with all that. And what if I was the lights boy on top? So I climbed up to the rigs on top and watched the dancer rehearse. And I took photographic snapshots of all the foot movements. And when I assembled all the foot movements, again I saw a kind of visual patterning emerging. And then the structure of the poem started emerging. And she was dancing to this very strict tal and bol, what we call in classical music. Ta dhin ta tai thai ta, ta dhin ta tai thai ta. So that kept resonating in my ear. So I said, if that is possible, can I not invent a new rhyme scheme? A, B, A, C, C, A, A, B, A, C, C, A. So then I invented that rhyme scheme, and then I said, let me work the poem in a way that it sort of fits that rhyme scheme. Now, that rhyme scheme doesn't exist in the English literature canon. Now it does. So these were the wonderful accidents and discoveries one sort of um, makes. And if one is obsessive and crazy like people like us who just want to follow passion in a way that it should be outside the prescriptive spaces of society or the industry.
It's actually very interesting because you're talking about mathematics
Very
in
much
the
so.
choreography, and I had the opportunity to teach maths this year. I hadn't taught maths before, and I was looking at it from an artist's perspective. And I
Right.
started seeing patterns. We were looking at trigonometry and geometry, and we're now looking at gaming.
Of
And I'm starting to
course.
get into the kind of gaming side of things. And I may be teaching next year, which I think is programming is similar in a sense to poetry because of the way the script. Have you been involved in any kind of programming, or
No,
is
I've
that a
not been
technology?
involved in computer programming, but I'm aware of what goes behind it. I mean, it's the whole thing of binary 1010. It's back to those basics, and it's a computation and permutation and combination of the same thing. Um, it's just another aspect of basic maths, I think, simple maths. It's just the applications have changed. And the way the application is presented has become much more sophisticated and faster and more efficient. Um, I mean, look at now, you can have a storage in your camera, which would otherwise you'll have reels and reels of film, to do what we are trying to do in a short space of time. So all that has, progressed and changed. But, there's always, you gain something, but you lose something. Uh, I have no problem. I am not one of those uh, acute because I've shot in film as well as digital, and high quality digital can be pretty good. I mean, but I know what the warmth of shooting in film and all that is. It's just like talking about whether you want to listen to music on a vinyl or a record as opposed to a digital streaming sound. But if you get the balance right, I think both medium can work really well. Um, so the computer or programming or gaming aspect was always there even before. We just use a new term for it. But the idea and the concept was used even before.
We're in a lovely garden today, and you were telling me before that New Delhi has like 26 million people, and
Yes.
I think for people in
It's very,
Ireland,
very sparsely populated.
yes, I think we would have a great sort of difficulty turning out the concept. How do you find that the city influences your work, or how often do you escape to the country like you've come to Ireland?
Well, really, to me, to tell you honestly, this is like heaven on earth. I mean, Anna McCarrick, the Guitar and Guthrie Center. I've been here before. My friend's house is particularly special. To sit here like this endlessly, morning to night. I mean, I do my work here, drink all my tea here, chat with people, and you just be outside. Of course, I'm told that this is a particularly uniquely good weather space you have. In a big city, of course, it's completely the opposite. It's noisy, it's chaotic, it's bustling, but I love it. I love all that. So, but you have to create your own oasis. So, my study where I work is a little chamber of silence, and whatever sounds I want to hear, I inject there, like the frog and the water or ambient music. So, I'm sort of in control, but I'm away from people, I'm away from everything else. You need it desperately. I remember there was a whole phase I went through where I was completely fascinated by graveyards, especially old graveyards. And this is pre-digital age, so I realized that was the only place you could be in the quiet, away from people. And so I used to do a lot of reading and writing in graveyards. And the older and the more decrepit the graveyard is, the more fascinating and interesting it was visually. And of course, I'm interested in light. So early mornings and late evenings when the sun slants through, and the pregnant calm that pervades the atmosphere is just magical. So that was then my space in big cities, of quietude and silence and reflection. But I must say that I can actually create these spaces wherever I am. A lot of it is to do with mental uh, space also. So even in a big city, I don't need the fancy Bose noise cancellation headsets. I can actually do it myself. There may be a lot of noise around you, but if you zone in to a space which is silent, you can be in a silent spot. So a lot of it is also comes through um, the whole binary we're talking about: yes, no, one, zero, erase, delete, or include. Maybe it's meditation or Eastern thought, but you can be in a very noisy space, but yet be very calm, and you can be in a very calm space and be agitated. So really, a lot of it is controlled by the human psyche. Um,
Having visited the West here, what advice would you maybe give to new writers who are trying to find their little space in their day to do writing?
I think the first and foremost things that new writers or any writer should do is to read a lot. They should read other people's writing. They should read the writings of the past. They should read stuff which they don't particularly like, because otherwise, if you're in your comfort zone, then you're never going to kind of push beyond a certain space. And I find it astonishing that a lot of writers, young writers I know, they don't read other people's writing. They're also obsessed with their own writing. Um, so I find reading a real pleasure. It's always been the case, and it still is. A good book or a good couple of books on a trip with you are the best friends you can possibly have, and music too. But I'm just saying, reading is probably key. So that would be the first thing, and the constant thing that should be there anyway. But the writing also involves a lot of clerical stuff. So you have to just get to the desk. It's not as glamorous as it sounds, because when you have the book published and people are sort of seeing you signing books and you're on tours reading and so on. That's the very, very small percentage, the glamour end of the whole thing. 98% of it is you're in a room or wherever you are with your pen or pencil or the keyboard, and you're bashing away words, and then you visit it again and again, and you sort of edit it, and a lot of it is not fun, but it can be depending on how you feel it is. But I think the rigor of reading and writing is very critical, and reading really, for instance, because I grew up with three languages: Hindi and Bengali, and to an extent Urdu, which I understand through my ear, but I can't read the script because it's a very different script. Um, has made me a better poet in English, for instance. I'm so grateful for these other languages, because the richness of tonality and structure that they bring to my English language writing is, made it to personally for me much richer. Just like, we talk about this whole thing in the English departments, the world English. What is world English? I mean, people really think of English as English English. That's the Queen's English, and now more and more American English. But there's so much more. There's the Caribbean English, there's the African English, there's the Indian English, there's the Australian, and the Canadian English, and the accents and the intonations are beautifully um, subtle and pliable and musical, because so each climate requires a different kind of register, and when you start traveling in those spaces, then you realize the sort of richness and the vastness of the language itself. It doesn't have to be just very clipped.
One of the thoughts that was coming as you were talking about language, that you've got three, maybe four languages that you're aware of, and you were also talking about the beauty of language, which I think is important. One of the difficulties, I think, from an English person's perspective, is that we tend to only know one language. What would the benefits be, do you think, of maybe explored other languages? How would that influence their writing if they were to learn another language?
Well, I think they'll be better as human beings to start with, because they are, rather than calling something the other, which people tend to call, they'll say it's us. So there's ourselves and then the others together as us. Other languages, of course, will broaden their horizons of speech and culture and so on. So it's obvious that what the benefits are. With the more you travel, the more you explore, the more you read, you're getting more in. I mean, we in India or many other parts of the world, we're very privileged that there's so many languages constantly just there. You're born into it. For instance, in India, we have 26 official languages. On the currency note, you'll have the same thing written 26 times. And depending on how, the language zones change. So the dialects, there are over 30,000 dialects, for instance. So it's insane. So even as Indians, we have no idea what someone else is speaking in distant parts of our country. So the bridge language then automatically kind of became partly Hindi because the ruling party was at the time, that was their main language. English because that was a bridge language, and so these two languages became the bridge languages. Except that not everybody wants to agree to that. So you have all the main so-called regional languages, Bengali being one. Except that the Bengali, I think, is in the fifth or sixth most biggest language in the world. So it's Chinese, Spanish, German, English, French. Bengali comes fairly close. Just the number of people who speak it around the world, largely, of course, in West Bengal and Bangladesh, and then the diaspora. In my house when I was growing up, or even now, it's so normal for us to have. We would, in a normal conversation, in the same sentence, we might use more than one language very easily without even thinking. So English is merging into Hindi, into Bengali, into Punjabi, and so on. Of course, when we are writing, then it becomes a bit more formal. We will stick to whatever. But then again, depending on the scenario, if it's a screenplay or a play script you're writing, then of course you write like what is around you because that's the way people speak. But otherwise, it's unipolar, boring. There's no color. How much pale do people want to be? Paler than pale. So I think it's a good thing. Diversity and other languages and other tongues bring. It makes for a much more better salad. Otherwise, it'll be just only lettuce, and you'll be struggling to find what else you put in.
You've talked about the diversity of the Indian culture, which I think is amazing. And one of the problems I think we have in the West at the moment is we're becoming very isolated in our way of thinking, almost going backwards. How would in India, how would they deal with different cultures, and how would they integrate those cultures? And what could we learn from that?
I mean, it'll be too presumptuous for me to say what the West can learn from Indians or vice versa. But as a regular citizen of the world, I would say, and hopefully we can all belong to passport-less, borderless spaces called world and humanity. But unfortunately, the politics and other economic forces don't allow for that because they won't make profit, and that's their mantra. Um, there's so much to learn. I mean, if you leave, there are two ways of living. For instance, one is for yourself, and it's solitary, and the only other person you allow is the partner of choice. So he or she will be allowed in that relationship. That's it, and you're operating within. Even within that, I know people have separate bank accounts and separate rooms and all that. So there's I and I don't necessarily become us. Whereas in India, you're actually growing up in a space where everything, a lot of things are just shared. The families tended to be larger. Of course, now it's becoming more smaller and smaller because of obvious reasons like money and so on. People are having less children, certainly in the big cities. So the focus becomes much more narrow and eye oriented. But if it's just eye oriented, you'll have all these millions of molecules which don't relate to each other. The world is going to fall apart. We were talking about science and lyricism and cadence and texture. It's only possible if different things collide and unite. Music can't be made in vacuum. Two things have to hit each other to create some sort of sounds. And by hit, I mean positive unification, not hit as dissonance. Dissonance is interesting as a concept in any of the art forms, but if people are not interacting, then the whole idea of, the spaceless, robotic, self-sufficient, lonely, depressed situation. That's why there's so much more depression and suicide and so on in the West. And East, it's also happening because, technology and the influence of the West you know, is quite prominent in these countries. So, but it's very important to be A, reflective, and then be inclusive. You know. So I is important, very important. I have no problem with it. But as long as you can fit yourself in depending on the circumstance and be happy to be part of a larger plate. I mean, imagine eating just one kind of food every day, or listening to the same kinds of songs, or reading the same kinds of literature, or having just great weather or bad weather. I mean, it'd be terribly monotonous. The word monotonous, it's mono and tone, and oddly, it's not us, really. So I think both sides can learn a lot from each other, and that's how society used to be. And in a peculiar kind of way, the more advanced we are getting, I think the world is becoming much more regressive in general. It's astonishing. Here we are in 2018. Parts of the world are being driven into the barbaric ages by so-called first world countries. And it's shocking. I mean, what is the point of education and civilization when you can't even, create a space where I'm not saying things will be all equal for everybody. That's an utopia. But at least there's a semblance of parity. You know, the hierarchies will always exist because of various things. But a sense of parity, which, makes for a much more equitable living and so on, be it the arts and living. So it's a bit worrying, the sort of political and trends that are all around us. What are we talking about? We're talking about Brexit,
Brexit, yes.
exiting.
Yeah.
Again, we want to be I as opposed to us.
And setting up barriers.
And setting up barriers
Yeah.
rather than
walls as opposed to bringing them down, which I think is. Does any of your? I mean, I think that this. We've been talking quite a lot about the way you've structured your poetry and the way. Is there anything you'd like to read to us of your work?
Sure, I'll read a few poems and then you can fit it in wherever you want
Yeah,
it. Yeah,
that'd be quite cool.
So let me start with a poem which is topical, or was topical. This was a poem called Kargil. It's called Kargil. Kargil is the place where the last flashpoint between India and Pakistan, the last war, started. And I visited this place 10 years after the war. Um, uh, my son and I, we were on this trip from Delhi all the way to Srinagar and Leh and Ladakh and back. So it was a big loop high into the Himalayas and down. And Kargil was actually not a place I would have stopped, but my young son then, he was saying, Baba, let's just go there because we'll find bullets and fragments. And so I said, of course you don't say no to your child. So we went along. And 10 years later, it was after 10 years, the war had, so it was an old, bustling, ordinary outpost of a town. So he kind of felt quite sheepish. But it was a real treat because I wouldn't have written this poem, for instance. I saw so much without having really seen anything. Kargil, and it opens with Derek Walcott's an epigraph from his book-length poem called Teocolo's Hound, and I quote, "Our street of smoke and fences, gutters gorged with weed and reeking, scorching iron grooves of rusted galvanize, a dialect forged from burning asphalt, and a sky that moves with thunderhead cumuli, grumbling with rain." 10 years on, I came searching for war signs of the past, expecting remnants, magazine debris, unexploded shells, shrapnels that mark bomb wounds. I came looking for ghosts, people past, skeletons charred, abandoned brick wood cement that once housed them. I could only find whispers, whispers among the clamor of a small town outpost in full throttle, everyday chores sketching outward signs of normalcy and life. In that bustle, I spot war lines of a decade ago, though the storylines are kept buried, wrapped in old newsprint. There's order amid uneasiness, the muezzins cry, the monks chant, baritones merging in their separateness. At the bus station, black coughs of exhaust smokescreen everything. The roads meet, and after the crossroad ritual, diverge, skating along the undotted lines of control. A porous garland with cracked beads adorns Tiger Hill. Beyond the mountains are dark memories, and beyond them no one knows. And beyond them no one wants to know. Even the flight of birds that wing over their crests don't know which feathers to down. Chameleon-like they fly, tracing perfect parabolas. I look up and calculate their exact arc and find instead a flawed theorem.
Lovely.
So this is a poem called Banyan. Banyan is this wonderful tree you find in India. This large, it's probably like the big daddy of the oak here. It's this large tree. But the wonderful thing about this tree is, it's got these tertiary roots which then go and meet the soil, much like stalagmites and stalactites. And then when the tree is fairly old, you have this sort of web. So the main trunk is in the middle, and all these other trunks are surrounding the thing. And often as children, we would play hide and seek. These were great trees to climb and hide. So it's ostensibly about that, but it's of course about various other things, about creating borders, about politics, and all kinds of things. Science. Banyan. As winter's secrets melt with the purple sun, what is revealed is electric. Notes tune unknown scales, syntax alters tongues, terracotta melts white, banyan ribbons into armatures as branch roots twist, meeting soil in a circle. Circuits glazed under cloth carry alphabets for a calligrapher's nib, italicized in invisible ink, letters never posted, cartographer's map uncharted. As phrases fold, so do veils. And this is a poem called Winter, as the sun blesses us and the light changes. And of course, living in Delhi, it's a very, very hot space. 10 months of the year is hot, and it can peak. The temperatures can go as high as 52, 53. It's crazy. It's just. So in a sense, the winter months are, for us, the most beautiful months, and it lasts for only 1.5 months or so. So this is a poem called Winter. It's probably a poem about yearning. It's probably a poem about various things. Winter. Couched on crimson cushions, pink bleeds gold, and red spills into one's heart. Broad leather keeps time, calibrating different hours and different zones, unaware of the grammar that makes sense. Only random woofs and snores of two distant dogs on a very cold night clears fog that is unresolved. New plants wait for new heat to grow, to mature. An old cane recliner contains poetry for peace, woven text keeping comfort in place. But it is this impatience of want that keeps equations unsolved. Heavy, translucent, vaporous, split red by mother tongues. Winter's breath is pink.
Very nice.
I'll read a poem which is part of my series of writing on erotica.
Okay.
We were talking about the world becoming regressive as we are going along. And I come from a country where, the Kama Sutra was written, the manual of the lovemaking, so to speak. And, there are these wonderful ancient and medieval temples with carvings of these erotic sculptures. And they were celebrated. These were celebrated by the gods and the people. I mean, they're gigantic pieces of sculptures, poetry in stone, really. And now people are trying to cover them up, and they're deleting and editing, and it's astonishing how we can't even grapple with sexuality in a way that which was much more free and acceptable in those times. And when you read the poetry of, say, Sappho, the Greek poetess, incredible feminist, probably the first feminist poets that are writing about same-sex love. You read Tamil Sangam poets of ancient India, and that they talk about spiritual love, courtly love, flesh love, lust love, all in this sort of wonderful symphonic space. And how it's now so divided between normal and pornography, as if there's nothing in between. It's a shame, really, because erotica is actually poetic, it's beautiful. It says just, it stops just short of things, and there's that lovely magic. So I told myself, let me give myself a challenge. Let me try writing some erotic poems or erotica and see how it goes, because I just think it's such a beautiful space to explore. And it's a very difficult space because you have to skate on this thin razor edge line. If you undercook it, it becomes like callow love poetry we might have written in school and college. And if you push it too far, then you enter the P space.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you dance in that space? So this one is one of the poems which is part of the series, and this one's called Desire. Under the soft, translucent linen, the ridges around your nipples harden at the thought of my tongue. You, lying inverted like the letter C, arch yourself deliberately, wanting the warm press of my lips. It's wet to coat the skin that is bristling, burning, breaking into sweats of desire, sweet juices of imagination. But in fact, I haven't even touched you. At least, not yet.
Very good.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I wrote a book called The Fall. In the very first scene, the couple get married, and I'm trying to build something in the same kind of way, because something tragic happens, but it happens at that point where you think there's going to be ecstasy in the same kind of way. So, but it was a very difficult piece to try and write, especially in the very first chapter of a book that you're actually writing.
No, I'd love to read it.
Yeah, so I must get it. I'll try and get you a copy.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But it was something that was very important because it was to indicate that marriage was important in the philosophy I was using, and although the story is told within that, It was how something corruptible came in just at the moment where it should have been bliss, and that was the story that I was trying to tell. Now, I might have been very awkward in the way that I presented it, but it was something that was quite interesting. And again, it's interesting listening to the words that you're saying there. That you're painting enough of a picture. It's like you said earlier on, where you don't give all the details, you give enough for the person, the audience, to paint the rest of the picture themselves.
You see, the audience and the reader is far more intelligent than we think they are. They are really recreating or creating the story you're writing, and everybody has a different interpretation and a different vision of the story you've written, or the poem you've written. That's the beauty of art, the universality of art. You can come from a very specific point, but if you're trained well and have the right tools, you know how to calibrate things. It's much like editing. What you leave out. It's like sound mixing. Do you want the bass higher, the treble lower, the mid-range, mid-tones to be modulated in a particular way? It's again, we're talking about the same set of things and rules. So the people who are really good at it are very, very subtle. You don't have to say much. Often it's just there, one little glance, one word here, one phrase there, that's enough.
It's interesting because I'd intended earlier on at some point to talk about editing, because editing is such an important part of what I do as a filmmaker. And you can imply things without actually saying things, which is again what we're talking about. Is there a process that you go through as an editor? Or how would you work with other authors?
Editing is crucial, I think. I mean, that's where the poem or the film or the photograph is made. I mean, the first flush, especially for poems, it's a very messy kind of assemblage of words and phrases. It's all kind of piled up. Think of it as the lump of clay, which then the sculptor goes and chisels and shapes with their hand on the stone. It's very similar. So you start eliminating things that is extraneous, or you start adding things that might add a bit of color or weightage, depending on what you want. So it's probably the most important part of the process. Of course, the base has to be very good. I mean, the idea needs to be good, the writing should be good, or the film or the photography should be good for you to have, the editing is process number two, but a very, very important process. I mean, I go through so many drafts of a given poem. I mean, I throw away most things. I mean, I don't throw everything away anymore, but I don't necessarily choose to publish everything I write. Because it needs to transcend beyond just your story. Otherwise, it's too much about you. And then what's the point? I mean, my story to myself is very boring. If it has to be reasonably interesting, then it has to be done in a way that people can relate to. And also the authorial stance, you have to bury the ego somewhere. You can't speak down or talk down. You have to speak as equals or together or as a community. Then I feel it's much, much more effective, because it can't be prescriptive ever. You can have a strong point of view, but if it's conveyed softly and reasonably and as a sensitive human being, then I think it's much more effective. Those things are much more powerful anyway.
Obviously, I've just been in your audience today, and I know that from editing film, I've become the first audience to many of the filmmakers I've kind of worked with in the past. Are there other ways that you engage with the audience to gauge their ways of thinking that might be interesting to talk about?
Yeah, so part of the editing process is I have a set of people who I would show my drafts to, people I trust. And they're not necessarily writers or filmmakers. They're just people who just are sensitive. And often they give me a very good feedback that, and I'm talking about, very fine-tuned things like, I mean, a lot of my final edits are to do with whether a semicolon should change into a comma, or should I replace it with a long dash, so that I have more visual space, and the visual space would then give me an elongated breath pause. So those are very, very minute things. But simple things like, sometimes you're very close to the text and you don't see it. Even after editing it, you realize you haven't actually edited it out because you're probably emotionally very close to it. So it takes someone else to just tell you, hey, listen, you said this twice, maybe, or thrice. Ah, of course, yeah. So I have a set of trusted people who probably read. And as you grow older, you have less and less of that because you're much more in control of your craft. But the craft is very, very important. And listening to other people who you trust is super important because we are all flawed people. I mean, perfection is not achieved, singularity. I mean, I owe it to the audience. I mean, the audience also partly makes what a book is. If it wasn't for their support and their appreciation, you know, I can just read it to myself and say, well, it's great, but really, So yeah, we are all part of the same community. Each one has a different task. We all have a different role. So, and it's very, very important to listen. Often people don't listen. They love to proclaim. Talking and conversation is, I find it very interesting, but didactic proclamation is problematic. In fact, the first instinct is okay, you don't want to hear it because someone's really talking about it. And as the saying goes, you can't command respect. You can't demand respect, but you can command respect. That can be done very softly. Just thought, George, I'd like to talk about another aspect. We're talking about a lot of the beautiful things in life and how things ought to be. But with the beauty, there's also grimness. There's always the other side of the coin. So, for instance, even though I come from a country where community means a lot, there's a lot of people, you're less likely to feel lonely and so on. But then too much of noise and people can be problematic too. So, for instance, when my mother died, uh, you have to go through some basic rituals of, there are rituals of burial and burning and feeding people and so on. And it was an eye opener for me because even I, for the first month, didn't have any time to grieve for my own mother because everything was so public. First of all, I mean, the day my mom died, I wasn't in the country, so I had to fly in. And then I saw my mother in the frozen in the morgue. But before I could even touch her, I had to sign all the hospital bills, pay all the dues. So it was all very strange. I mean, here I am trying to kind of, but of course the system is such that I can't even see the body. So all that is done, fine. I get the body out, and then there's a whole ritual, few days, where there are these pujas and ceremonies and beautiful things, of course. But and you feed people, the community is there, everybody's coming and giving you condolences, and it's all good, except that my relationship with my mother, I mean, I've not had the space to even shed a tear because I'm running around doing things. And the most ironic thing is, my mother is not officially dead until I have a certificate from the municipal corporation that the death certificate. And it's only after having 3 copies of that that she's really dead and valid. I just find it very, very odd and strange that we have to live with this kind of dichotomy. But that's where the poem comes from. And I thought that shows another side of our cultural space, really.
And just before you start, what is interesting is that I've had a similar experience with my father and my father-in-law passing away, and we went through, in our culture, the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting thing to hear.
Yeah. So it's simply called Ma, which is mother in Bengali. As if in a dream, you disappeared unannounced, untimely, and unprepared. The handwritten diary you left behind weepingly revealed your sordid, searing pain. Grief struck, I run around the city's municipal offices, rummaging through bureaucratic files, seeking your death certificate for validation. as if losing you wasn't loss enough.
I would normally, actually, it's quite funny because I'd normally ask a question if there's anything that you'd like to close with, but that's actually a very nice way of closing.
I think,
unless there's something else you would like to.
no, I think that's the closure, which is perfect. It's paying respect to my parents. Basically, made me what I am. I owe them everything.
Yeah.
Had it not been for them and their generosity, I wouldn't be where I am. And what else can I say? I think silence is louder, so it's best left
Absolutely.
in that space, because in silence we have everything.
Too deep. That was lovely. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Really, my pleasure. I enjoyed it very, very much, and what a treat. This is what's more important, the
Yes.
connection.
Thank you.